Chapter 13, Part 2, Western Expansion and Southern Secession, 1830 to 1861. After the addition of the new territory from the Mexican-American War, there also began a drive in the United States to economically join the East and the West closer together. In order to make the country more productive, we needed a better transportation system to join that Eastern Territory to the new Western Territories. And so one of the best ways to do that would be to create a transcontinental railroad. The addition of a transcontinental railroad would bring about, though, another controversy over slavery. If you build the railroad in the north, the southern slave states would be opposed to it because it would give an economic advantage to the northern states. Conversely, if you built it in the south, the northern anti-slave states would be opposed to it because it would give the southern states an economic advantage. So Stephen Douglas, who's the leader of the Democratic Party, which straddles both the North and the South, came up with an idea that he thought would be a good compromise. It becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Instead of building the proposed new railroad in the north or the south, building it more in the middle. And so we would take this very large territory that had been known as the Nebraska Territory and dividing it into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, which would give the opportunity to eventually have two new states, Kansas and Nebraska. Instead of having the Missouri Compromise line enforced, the Kansas-Nebraska Act proposed getting rid of the Missouri Compromise line and allowing popular sovereignty in this new Kansas-Nebraska territory and consequently the Kansas-Nebraska states once they were adopted. This brings about a great deal of controversy. The northern states see this as an opportunity for slavery to expand, which they are opposed to, because both Kansas and Nebraska would be above that 36° 30 line from the old Missouri Compromise. The southern states like the idea because it gives them the opportunity to perhaps expand slavery into Kansas, which is right next door to Missouri. They know it probably won't move into Nebraska because that's too far north, but they see it as an opportunity to at least gain one more slave state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act very narrowly passes Congress, mostly because even the northern congressmen see the economic advantage of having a transcontinental railroad. They oppose the expansion of slavery, but they know that we need to join the East and the West closer together economically. So this is going to bring about a huge controversy in Kansas, where we're going to see both the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces fighting each other, interfering with the elections in Kansas, both trying to influence those elections for their side. This map shows us the result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, where now you can see that slavery would be open to that new Kansas territory. It would also be open to the new Nebraska territory, but as we stated earlier, most people realize that Nebraska would be too far north for slavery to take hold in the Nebraska territory. In order to influence the elections in Kansas, both pro-slavery forces from Missouri and anti-slavery forces from Illinois and other parts of the country began moving into Kansas, trying to get enough votes for their side to make Kansas either free or slave. As it turned out, the pro-slavery forces won out, and in the elections, Kansas voted to become a slave territory, which ultimately would make them a slave state. The anti-slavery forces in Kansas said that the election was unfair, that many people from Missouri had moved into the area just to vote and were not real citizens of Kansas, and they refused to recognize the results of the election, and they set up their own little government in Kansas. So what we're beginning to see in Kansas in the 1850s is a microcosm of the Civil War. We're going to have two opposing governments, one free and one slave, in Kansas, and ultimately we're going to have fighting there. The way the fighting begins is this radical abolitionist, John Brown, came into Kansas with 6 followers and attacked a pro-slavery village in Kansas, Pottawatomie Creek. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. He believed that he was God's instrument on earth and God had directed him to end slavery by any means possible. And so he attacked this pro-slavery settlement in Kansas, Pottawatomie Creek, and he and his followers hacked 5 people to death with broadswords. And of course, because of the tensions in Kansas at the time, the pro-slavery forces in Kansas did not see this as an act of a madman. They saw it as a coordinated effort by abolitionists to take control of Kansas. And so then they will rise up and they will attack abolitionist settlements in Kansas. And so we begin to have in the mid-1850s in Kansas what's known as Bleeding Kansas. It's a mini civil war in Kansas. At the same time, we're going to have fighting breaking out in the U.S. Congress. Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts, is also an ardent abolitionist. And he made a speech in the Senate one day condemning the actions in Kansas, blaming it on the pro-slavery forces in Kansas. And he also began to make some rather personal attacks on Southern senators. And one of the ones that he made some really rather harsh comments about was the senator from South Carolina, Senator Butler. Senator Butler was not in the Senate that day, which may have influenced Charles Sumner to say some of the things that he said about him. But Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, was a congressman. And if you've ever been to the Capitol, you know that the Senate meets on one side of the Capitol and the House of Representatives meets on the other side. And so what's happening in the Senate is pretty much well known to the members of the House. So word got to Preston Brooks that Sumner was making these rather disparaging comments about his uncle and his family. And so Preston Brooks left the House chambers, walked over to the Senate, and took his walking cane. It was very fashionable for gentlemen to carry walking canes in the 1850s, and took his walking cane and beat Charles Sumner almost to death on the Senate floor. Sumner sustained injuries that kept him out of the Senate actually for 4 years. He was almost crippled from the attack. Preston Brooks, after this attack, he resigned from the Senate, resigned from the House, went home to South Carolina, where he was immediately reelected to go back. But what we see with the attack on Sumner in the Senate is that even our congressmen who are sent there to represent us are beginning to resort to fighting. And we see that after this attack, many congressmen and senators began to arm themselves before going into the House and Senate chambers because they fear that they're going to be attacked. So we're moving closer and closer to the Civil War with fewer and fewer chances really of coming up with some compromise to end our conflicts regarding slavery peacefully. So by the time we get to the election of 1856, slavery is becoming a huge question in the country, the extension of slavery into the territories. And in this election, we have for the first time a new political party that is very much an anti-slavery party, and that is the Republican Party. The election of 1856 is the first time that the Republican Party will run a candidate for the presidency, and they select John C. Fremont as their candidate. This is the same John Fremont who helped California gain their independence from Mexico. And their slogan in the campaign was "Free soil, free men, and Fremont." As you can imagine, since it is an anti-slavery party, the Republican Party only has support in the North. It is not going to have any support in the South. The Democrats are going to select James Buchanan as their candidate. Stephen Douglas, who had been the leader of the Democratic Party, was considered to be too controversial for many Southerners. They felt that he had not been supportive enough of slavery, and so Buchanan was selected over Stephen Douglas in this election. James Buchanan will win this election. He will take all of the Southern votes, of course, and he will win enough of the Northern votes to win this election. This map shows us the election results from the election of 1856. You can see those blue states is where Buchanan won. He won 174 electoral votes, and really an overwhelming majority of the states. And John C. Fremont won just a few states, but he won pretty highly populated states like New York, and he won 114 electoral votes. Millard Fillmore, who was the former president, ran as a third-party candidate, the American Party, and he won a couple of states and 8 electoral votes. Soon after Buchanan was inaugurated as the president, the country was hit by an economic depression. And because the North was more industrialized, this depression hit the North harder. And that's going to have some long-time consequences. One of the things that happened because the North was hit harder by this is that it helped to strengthen the Republican Party in the North and weaken the Democratic Party in the North. It is kind of natural for us in America when we have a depression, we tend to blame the party in power. And since Buchanan and the Democrats have been in power for most of the last few election cycles, the Northerners blame the Democratic Party for the depression, and they gravitate more toward the Republican Party. And so we're going to see a strengthening of the Republican Party in the North. So we began to see, as a result of that, the country divided along more political lines, the South being more Democratic, the North being more Republican. We also see that since the North was harder hit by the Depression, that the Southerners basically see that as validation, that their system of life, their economic system, their agricultural system is validated, that their system is better than that industrial system in the North, and that gravitates them more to holding on to those Southern traditions, including the Southern tradition of slavery. Another controversy that hits Buchanan soon after his election is the Supreme Court case known as the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave who belonged to an Army surgeon, Dr. Emerson, who was from Missouri. Dr. Emerson, being in the military, was transferred to free state and free territories. And when he went to these free territories and free states, he took Dred Scott with him. Dr. Emerson died, and Dred Scott was brought back to Missouri, where he will sue for his freedom. He sued based on the assumption that since he had resided for many years in free states and free territories, then he should be free. As you can imagine, this is a huge case, and eventually it will make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. When the case gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time is Roger Taney. And Taney decided that there was more than just one issue in question. And the 3 issues in question was, first, was Dred Scott a citizen? This is very important to decide. If Dred Scott is a citizen of Missouri and the United States, then he has the right to sue. If he is not a citizen, he does not have the right to sue. Secondly, the second issue, Taney said, was this issue of temporary residency. Does a temporary residency in a free territory grant a slave freedom? Does a temporary stay in a free territory grant a slave freedom? And the third issue, Tani said, was the Missouri Compromise line. Was the Missouri Compromise line constitutional? So in this case, on the first issue, the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen. He was not a citizen of the state of Missouri, nor was he a citizen of the United States. This is huge because it's saying that Dred Scott is not a citizen. That means that slaves are not citizens. Because remember, when the Supreme Court speaks, it's not really for just that one instance. It would cover all slaves. Secondly, the Supreme Court ruled that a temporary stay in a free territory did not grant a slave freedom. So this will allow slaveholders to take their slaves wherever they need to take without fear that they will lose their slaves once they return home. And on the third issue, the Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment. There's a provision in the Fifth Amendment that says that you cannot deny a person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the Supreme Court ruled that by just drawing a line and saying that slaves could not be allowed above that line, you were denying slaveholders their property without due process. So the slave forces won on all three issues in the Dred Scott case. And the South is very pleased that they are validated in their minds that slavery is constitutional and they can take their slaves wherever they want. The Dred Scott case, though, has some negative consequences because the abolitionists are now very frightened because once you erased the Missouri Compromise line and said that slaveholders could take their slaves anywhere, it's basically saying you can't have free states, that the free states cannot deny a slaveholder from bringing their slaves into their state. So the Dred Scott case is another instance where we're going to see a pulling apart of the free and the slave states that's bringing us closer and closer to the Civil War. By the mid-1850s, we're really beginning to see how different the North and the South have evolved. There are huge economic differences between the two regions. The North is very urban, many more cities. It has most of the industry in the country. About 90 to 95% of the industry in the country is in the North, versus the South, which is much more rural and an agricultural society that relies predominantly on cotton for its economic success. The West has attributes of both the North and the South, but because of the trading relationships that the West has with the northern eastern states, we're beginning to see that the North and the West are drawing closer together. There are social and religious differences as well. Socially, in the South, we see a much more aristocratic system. Slaveholders that own these large plantations control most of the political power in the South. The North is more democratic in that more people can vote and have political power there. Slavery, of course, is deeply embedded into the Southern society because of the plantation system. And we do see some slavery in a few of the northern states, like New York, where slaves are used in the harbor areas. And we do see that while the North is mostly against slavery, they are still racist. They do believe, for the most part, that blacks are inferior. So there are still issues in both areas regarding race, but at least in the North, there's not slavery. This chart emphasizes more in detail some of the things we talked about on the previous slide. You can see in the South we have a more of a biracial population. About 35%, a little over a third of the population is African American, most of those being slaves. While in the North it is overwhelmingly white, only about 2% were African Americans, free blacks for the most part. Economically, the South is predominantly agriculture, 84% of it working in agriculture, while in the North you only have about 40% of the workforce working in agriculture, so 60% being more industrialized and urban. In the South you have mostly slave labor, very dependent upon slave labor, while in the North you have the free wage labor. About 85% of the nation's factories were in the North, while the South is, because of its being mostly agricultural, very few factories in the South. Most of the railroad track is also in the North. The North has about 20,000 miles of railroad track, while the South only has about 10,000 miles, so double the amount. And literacy. The South has a more than double illiteracy rate. This we know going all the way back to colonial times, where it was harder in the South to get an education. In 1859, another major event is going to occur, which is going to move us closer to the Civil War. And this is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. This is the same John Brown that had attacked those pro-slavery villages in Kansas. He had escaped from Kansas, but he had not given up his quest to end slavery in America. By the time we get to 1859, John Brown has amassed around him 18 followers, which is more than he had in Kansas. Remember, he only had 6 in Kansas. So he's going to have 18 followers, and their goal is to foment a slave rebellion. The idea is that they'll start the slave rebellion in Virginia, which is in the upper South, and that it eventually will spread all through the South, and the slaves will rise up off the plantations and overthrow their white masters. Because they will need weapons for this slave rebellion, John Brown and his followers decide to attack Harper's Ferry, Virginia first. Harper's Ferry is a military arsenal. That is a place where we store weapons. And surprisingly enough, initially, John Brown and these 18 followers are able to take control of the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry for a brief time. Then federal troops are brought in under Robert E. Lee, and they are able to regain control of the arsenal. During the fighting at Harper's Ferry, 2 of John Brown's sons who had joined him in the movement were killed. Several other of his followers were injured, and eventually John Brown will decide to surrender when he sees that it's hopeless, and he will be arrested. He is charged with treason, where he will be found guilty of treason, and eventually he will be hanged. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry is really considered to be one of the major catalysts toward the Civil War, because Southerners view John Brown's raid as an attack on them. They are looking at not if there will be another attempt, but when there will be another attempt by the North to invade the South. And so as a result of John Brown's raid, we begin to see the Southern militias really beginning to organize. They do huge recruiting drives. They begin to train and plan for what they see as an invasion from the North. And that's part of the reason when the Civil War starts, that in the first few months, the first year of the war, the South is actually militarily a little better prepared for the fight than the North, because these Southern militias have already been organizing as a result of John Brown's raid. This is a very famous picture of John Brown. You can see where they're making him look very kind of radical there. And then you can see the symbolism of it starting the Civil War with the Confederates on one side and the Union on the other, and the two dead soldiers on each side, and the tornado in the background, and all of the mass chaos in the background that you can see from the war. By 1860, the tensions between the North and the South are very intense, and we're moving into this election cycle. The Republican Party decided really to elect a more moderate candidate for their presidential candidate in 1860, and that's why they chose Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was known to be opposed to the extension of slavery, but he was not considered a radical like a Charles Sumner or even a John C. Fremont before. He was noted to have said that, he would hope that we could end slavery peacefully in the country. There will be a third party in this election, the Constitutional Union Party, and they will select John Bell as their candidate. They say that they support the Constitution and the Union. They are opposing any type of secession. The Democratic Party is split. This election becomes very apparent that the Democrats are both a Northern and a Southern party. When they held the Democratic Convention in 1860, Stephen Douglas was selected as the Democratic candidate. Many of the Southerners did not like Douglas. They felt that he had not been a strong enough supporter of the South and slavery. So the Southern Democrats are going to break away from the Democratic Party, hold their own convention, and they will select John Breckinridge as their candidate. So we will actually have 4 candidates running for the presidency in 1860. And whenever you have this many candidates, you can see that the votes really get very divided up. Abraham Lincoln, as a Republican candidate, will not even be on the ballot in many of the southern states because they opposed him so adamantly. Bell, as a third-party candidate, is going to get a minor number of votes, and John Breckinridge actually will receive the largest number of votes from the Democratic Party. Lincoln will actually, as we know, win the election, but he wins the election without a majority of the votes. But he does win a majority in the Electoral College, but he does not win an overwhelming majority of the popular vote. This is our election map from the election of 1860. So you can see, while Abraham Lincoln won 180 of the Electoral College votes, the vote between him and Stephen Douglas for the popular vote was actually pretty close. And then John Breckinridge actually came in second in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote, he was well behind both Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Well, throughout the election of 1860, some of the southern states, especially South Carolina, had said that if a Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, won the presidency, that it would show that they were not safe in the Union and that they would secede from the Union. So soon after the Electoral College met and elected Abraham Lincoln to the presidency, South Carolina called a state convention and they voted to secede from the Union in December of 1860. Soon after South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, we began to see some of the other southern states, what we call the Deep South, seceding from the Union. And we will initially have 7 southern states that will secede from the Union: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February of 1861, these 7 states will join together and create the Confederate States of America. They will name Jefferson Davis as their president. And they will issue a declaration of causes of why they felt that they were unsafe in the Union and why they felt that they needed to create their own country. Interestingly enough, the Confederate Constitution is almost identical to the U.S. Constitution. A couple of differences was that it called for the president to have a 6-year term rather than a 4-year term. And it will also allow the president a line item veto that will allow him to not veto entire bills, but just a section of a bill. But other than that, and the fact that they state that the states have sovereignty, the Constitution is very similar to the U.S. Constitution. This map shows our original 7 Confederate states. Of course, we're going to get a couple of extra ones a little bit later, but the states in the beige are your 7 states that seceded before Fort Sumter. The purple states, the light purple, those are going to be the southern states that are going to secede after the battle at Fort Sumter, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And then the Union states are kind of that aqua color that we'll see. By the time Lincoln is inaugurated in March of 1861, of course, these 7 Confederate states have seceded from the Union. And when he makes his inauguration address, he does not make a statement against slavery. He actually says that if he can preserve the Union by maintaining slavery, then he will maintain slavery. If he can preserve the Union by destroying slavery, he will destroy slavery. One of the main things that Lincoln wanted to do was he wanted to ensure the loyalty of the border states, and he knew that if he abolished slavery in 1861, it would push the border states completely out of the Union. So Lincoln's main goal at his inauguration is to preserve the Union. He does not recognize the legitimacy of the Southern states' secession, and he makes that clear that he wants to preserve the Union. That brings us to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a fort in South Carolina, in the harbor of South Carolina. And when South Carolina seceded from the Union, they began to try to take control of the federal property in their states, as did other southern states that seceded from the Union. Fort Sumter refused to surrender to South Carolina, but they were in a predicament by the spring of 1861. They were running out of provisions, so President Lincoln decided that he would send a ship there to re-provision them, to bring them food. The Confederates are going to fire on that ship, and so the ship will turn around. Lincoln at this point does not want to provoke an attack. He does not want it to look like the Union is starting the war, so he ordered those Union ships that if they were fired upon, for them to turn back. So when the Confederates fired on them, they did turn back. That does not bring an end, of course, to the controversy at Fort Sumter. The South Carolinians wanted control of Fort Sumter. They felt that it was a necessity for them, for their defense, to control this fort in their harbor. So South Carolina gave Major Anderson, who was the commander at Fort Sumter, an ultimatum that he had until midnight on April 12th, 1861, to surrender the fort. General P.G.T. Beauregard is the Confederate commander in South Carolina, and when Major Anderson refused to surrender the fort, by the time period, General Beauregard will order them to open fire on the fort, and for an entire day, the fort is under bombardment. At the end of the day, Major Anderson, recognizing that he really is in a difficult situation, he doesn't have enough food, he doesn't have enough supplies, decides that he will surrender. The firing on Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the actual Civil War, because this is the first fighting that occurs in the Civil War. An interesting side note about Fort Sumter is that there were no casualties in the entire fighting at Fort Sumter. The only casualty was a Confederate horse that was killed in the fighting, but no human casualties in the fighting at Fort Sumter. But after Fort Sumter, we will see that everyone recognizes that there will be war. And we will see that the next 4 southern states will secede from the Union. After Fort Sumter, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas will secede from the Union and join the Confederate States of America. So that will bring us to 11 Confederate states. But that is not all the slave states. We will have the border states, 5 border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia, which were all slave states, will stay in the Union. West Virginia is interesting because there was no West Virginia before the Civil War, but the western provinces of Virginia did not want to secede from the Union. So those western counties will secede from Virginia when Virginia leaves the Union. And so it is beginning with the Civil War that we actually get a West Virginia. And after these 11 states create the Confederate States of America, we will see that both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, begin to call up for enlistments and begin to plan and organize for the war. This concludes our Chapter 13 PowerPoint. In Chapter 14, we will actually talk about the Civil War.